Today, I'll be sharing with you my experience and long-term review after using the Samsung Galaxy S23 for the past 3 months. The Galaxy S23 corrects on some of the big shortcomings from the previous S22, namely with much better performance and battery life, but still the S23 is not perfect. But don't worry, in this video I'm going to be covering everything you need to know right after this message from today's video sponsor, AHOI. This is the AHOI custom length USB cable set for fast charging. You get both USB-C and MFI certified lightning cables, making them compatible with phones, tablets, laptops, and more. I especially like the super short 0.3 feet USB-C and lightning cables. These are super easy to take with you every day and use with a battery pack. Say you can use them while charging in your hand or in your pocket. On a desk, the 2.6 foot extension cable gives you more length, and then simply attach whichever connector you need. These thick cables are rated for 30,000 bends, so can last for years, and all support PD 3.1 240 watt fast charging. And then my favorite for charging in the car or from a backpack, you get the 5.5 foot spring cable, and this is flexible in length, giving you the reach when you need it, while also tucking away nicely when not in use. The cables can be mixed and matched to really suit your occasion, going all the way from 10 centimeters in length up to 260, and you can simply attach or remove them with this secure screw down mechanism to make sure your connection stays secure. And I especially like the inclusion of a charge status light on the cables as well. The kit also comes with a silicone pouch to carry on the go. To learn more about the AHOI custom length USB cable set and to step up your charging game, be sure to click the links in the description. So in terms of the design, the S23 features a very similar design compared to last year's S22. So on the back, we get this nice matte glass finish, which I think looks great, also feels good to the touch, and does a very good job at resisting fingerprints, which is always a plus. And then on the sides, we have a shiny, polished aluminum frame, which has a slight curve to it, and as a result, actually makes it really comfortable to hold and use in the hand, much more so than, say, the iPhone 14, which has a much more boxy, sharper edge. So this little curve goes a long way. And then looking at the back of the phone, I would say the biggest, and I put this in relative terms, the biggest redesign that we get with the S23 is the camera module, where as you can see now, the lenses are housed separately, much like the S23 Ultra, which I think gives it a very clean look and is something that I do like. In terms of the durability, after 3 months of use, I'll say that my display has held up quite well in the sense that there's no cracks. However, if I do look very closely, I do have a few scratches just from normal day-to-day use, so I do recommend you definitely put on a screen protector. On the back of the phone, however, I have no scratches, no cracks, and this has held up really well. And then on the sides, if I look very closely, I can find a few hairline marks, but these are very hard to spot and honestly don't really have any impact on the phone as a whole. So all in all, while I wouldn't call the design of the S23 particularly exciting, it is a good looking design that is sharp and makes some improvements compared to last generations, and I think from a durability perspective has held up quite well. The S23 brings a 6.1 inch display, which for many people is going to be that perfect size and striking that right balance between being easily usable in one hand. You can reach all corners of the display while still being big enough to consume your content. The display is also super sharp, so has a pixel per inch count of 425, and this means that any text, your images are going to be super sharp on this display, and realistically speaking, you can't discern individual pixels. But I think even more important than that is the 120 Hz refresh rate, which makes everything on the phone feel super smooth, whether it be system animations, scrolling through apps. It actually makes the phone feel more responsive and faster, and I've got to say, really puts the iPhone 14 60 Hz to shame. The refresh rate is also adaptable, so it can go from 120 Hz down to 48 Hz depending on what you are doing. So if, say, you are on a static image like this, it will lower the refresh rate to be more efficient and save battery. And I think this does have a significant impact on the battery life on the S23, but I'll talk more about that in a sec. The display on the S23 is a dynamic AMOLED display, and this means that your colors are really going to pop. And I must say, compared to last year's S22, the color reproduction on the S23 is more accurate, with better dynamic range, more contrast, and unlike the S22, doesn't have a slight greenish tinge. So I'm glad to see Samsung have corrected that on the new S23. A really big difference as well is in the brightness. Now the S23 gets up to 450 nits brighter compared to the last year's S22. S22, and I can tell you this makes a really big difference, especially when out in the sun, looking at maps or wanting to reply to a message. 450 nits is a huge jump up in brightness, and it's something I appreciate very often. All in all, I really enjoy the display on the S23 and can firmly say that this is the best display in any smartphone at its price. I also really like the pinhole camera on the front of the display. This has a minimal impact on your screen space, unlike, for example, the notch or the dynamic islands you'll find on the iPhone. And since it is so small, it really kind of disappears almost with time. And then under the screen, we get the ultrasonic fingerprint sensor, which is super reliable and fast and is my go-to way of unlocking my S23. Now let's talk about the camera. So the S23 has a triple lens camera system on the back. So we get a 50 megapixel main sensor, 12 megapixel ultra wide, and a 10 megapixel telephoto lens. And then on the front, we now have a 12 megapixel sensor as opposed to a 10 megapixel sensor found on the S22. Now on paper, the two phones are very similar, but in the real world, there are some differences in the results of the photos. So let's take a look at some real world examples and compare the two. So comparing the Galaxy S23 versus last year's S22, you can see that the S23 has a slightly warmer temperature in the images, and this to me creates a more pleasing photo overall. You can see this in the color in the flowers, as well as in this example here. And in terms of the contrast, I would say you actually get slightly more on the S22, where the 23 has more of a flat look. And you can see this here in the bricks, as well as the paint of the wall. And this to me creates a slightly more true to life image on the S23. When it comes to sharpness, they're both very close. You get good detail both in the skyline as well as the water and the glass on the buildings. Though in close-up shots, I have found finer textures. For example, here on my sofa, the S23 does have the edge in terms of the detail. And then when it comes to the dynamic range, both perform well. However, the S23 does take the edge, which I think shows slightly more detail in the dark parts of the cars, and also seen here in the pots of the plants in particular. When it comes to the bokeh, I found that you get better looking and more bokeh on the S23, and this is especially great for portrait photography. And when it comes to the ultra-wide lens, I found it to be slightly sharper on the S23 and also more accurate in terms of the colors, where the S22 has a slight magenta tone. Flipping over to the selfie camera, the S22 is sharper and I think also shows better skin tones, but the S23 does have a more shallow depth of field and also more dynamic range when you look at my coat and scarf. And finally, in low light photography, both are really amongst the best, but the S23 is even better with less grain on the walls and also in the coffee shown. And then turning to video, although both are still not as good as on the iPhone, you still get solid video from both. I have found though that the S23 to be even more stable, and the S23 now also is able to shoot at up to 8K in 30 FPS compared to 8K at 24 on the S22. And I think 30 FPS is a much better frame rate, especially for uploading online. So the cameras on the S23 perform really well, and while I wouldn't say they are significantly better compared to the S22, they do add some small improvements that I think do show in the real-world examples, and this makes the S23 cameras even better than the already great S22 cameras, meaning it is really amongst the best camera system you're going to find for this price. But one thing that did stand out to me is the shutter lag, and this is the delay between pressing the button and it actually taking the photo. I found this to be significantly more on the S23 compared to, say, the S22, and I do hope that this is something that Samsung can fix in a future software update. Now, last year's S22 really fell short when it came to the battery life, and this I think is one of the key pillars in any smartphone. So the question is, has the S23 fixed this issue? And the answer is yes. The S23 has made a huge leap forward in terms of the battery life, and this is due to two reasons. First, we get a slightly larger battery, but more importantly than that, I think, as we now get a much better optimized processor. And combined, this makes a huge difference, where the S22 got me just about 5 to 6 hours of screen on time, where the S23 is now able to get me 7 to 8 hours of screen on time. And this puts it on par with the current iPhone 14 and 14 Pro. And this difference is really big, as this means that the S23 is able to last me a full day as well as the evening without needing a top up throughout the day. And for me especially, I find this to be absolutely essential. And while I love to see USB-C on the S23, it does only support up to 25 watts, which I would consider to be semi-fast, and it would have been great to see Samsung bring the truly fast 45 watt charging from the S23 Plus or the Ultra to make the charging experience even better. When it comes to the performance, the S23 has a Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 chip, which now for the first time is optimized for the S23. And this is really important as this makes a huge difference in the overall performance. The S23 compared to the S22 is overall noticeably smoother to use, with much less random lags, stutters, or hiccups, and overall feels much more refined. And this is largely due to the better optimization between hardware and software, and this is a difference that I truly feel every day. To add to this, the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 chip is also much more efficient, and this is the biggest contributor to the much better battery life that we get on the S23. And the 8GB of RAM on board mean that switching apps is super fast, and they also stay open long in the background. Whether you be doing productivity apps, watching videos, this all keeps up very well. And in heavier apps such as photo or video editing, the S23 does load noticeably faster compared to last year's S22. All of this is to say is that better optimization means you get better performance, and in my opinion, amongst the best Android experience you can get out right now. But the question is, how long will this last? Well, in terms of longevity, Samsung promises 4 more years of updates and 5 more years of security updates for the S23. Now, while this is not yet the 6 to 7 years that you get on an iPhone, Android is catching up, and it is clear that Samsung is leading this charge, and this is great to see. Other small quality of life features like the haptic motor on the S23 is also amongst the best on the Android side. This is great because this allows me to differentiate a vibration from a message or call, which will be a stronger vibration, and then a weaker vibration would be a system notification. Little things like this are nice to have. To add to this, the speakers on the S23 compared to the S22 are louder and also have more detail, especially in the highs, and generally have more depth. And this is especially great when watching videos or listening to music. So at the end of the day, is the S23 worth it after 3 months of use? Well, the S22 had some pretty big shortcomings, and I think the S23 really more than makes up for these, namely the battery life, as well as the general performance. The S23 now has all-day battery life, putting it on par with the iPhone 14, and the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 chip mean you get vastly smoother performance, and that is something that you notice every day. While I would not call the S23 an exciting phone, for example, I would have loved to see more in terms of the design, faster charging, and some new sort of innovative wow feature, what the S23 does do is deliver a really compelling all-around package that is hard to beat for the price, and after 3 months of use is one that I can still highly recommend. Oh, and by the way, if you are picking between a slightly cheaper S22 or the S23, trust me, save a little bit more or pay that bit extra and go for the S23 instead. Believe me, it's worth it. Anyway guys, thank you so much for watching this video. Let me know if you have any questions at all about the S23 or any of the current S23 lineup. If you haven't seen them yet, I highly recommend watching my S23 versus iPhone 14 comparison video, as well as my S23 first 10 things to do video to get the most out of your battery life, performance, and as well as the features. Thanks again for watching guys, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.